Welcome, colleagues, both here physically and online. We're happy to have you with us for um, what's going to be a very interesting seminar. Unfortunately, it's our last seminar of the year, but I think it's going to be a very good one. Uh, so we're very happy to have with us Dr. Athambile Masola from the Historical Studies Department at the University of Cape Town. Um, we'll be presenting on someone known as Pumla and Ngozwana, but I think to many in the audience will be familiar as Pumla Kisosonkole. Very distinguished and accomplished legislator, activist, writer in Ugandan history. And so we're very, I think this is going to be quite an interesting topic for many of us. We're very happy to have you with us. As the discussant, we have Professor Susan Chiguli from the Department of Literature, and we're just very pleased to have both of you here for the seminar. I'm Edgar Taylor. I'm a lecturer in the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies. If anyone is both online or here is not on our mailing list, you can just send me a message and I will add you um, to the list. Um, so yes, we can be. We should be audible online. I just want to confirm that. If for those online, if you could just stay muted until we get to the discussion session, that would be greatly appreciated. Our speaker will have anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour, really as long as you want to talk, and then we'll hand it over to our discussant for up to 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. And then after you respond, then we'll open the floor to discussion from the floor. You may hear, for those in the room, definitely maybe online, there is an event going on outside, so you may hear just music in the background enlivening the conversation. But I do hope that everyone will be able to hear and concentrate on the discussion today. So with that, I just want to say it's really a great pleasure and honor for the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies to welcome Dr. Masola, and I'll hand over the floor to you. Yeah.
Hey, am I audible? Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for, okay, maybe let me lean in a bit. Thank you so much, Edgar, for organizing this and Prof for agreeing to be a discussant. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'll try to speak as audibly as possible because we are competing with outside events, as is the nature of the humanities. I always feel like we're competing. So I've got a few slides that I want to share before we get into the paper. And I won't read the paper as such because I'll speak to it. And there are sections of it that I will probably read. But just to give some context, so the figure I am talking about that Edgar has already mentioned is Pumla Ngozwana. She was born Pumla Ngozwana. I'm not sure what to do about I'll just say admit maybe. Oh, okay. I'm just worried. Okay, but I'm sure you can see most of the screen. Yeah. So this is the figure that we are going to be discussing today, and this is part of a longer project, a biography project, which I began in 2020. And this chapter is trying to make sense of how to write about a figure who is from one country and moves to another country and moves around, basically. And that's like the biggest conundrum I have in terms of this research. And so this is the picture that I first find of her, which is in a newspaper, in a South African newspaper called The Bantu World. And so since 2020, I've been trying to put together a timeline. And I'm sorry, the font is so small. I didn't realize it was going to be this small. So I'll just quickly read through it. So she was born in an area called Mount Frere in 1911. And grows up this is in the area in the Eastern Cape. And for those who want to have a broader sense of the Eastern Cape, this is the area where Nelson Mandela is also from. So that kind of locates. And she attends one of the missionary schools, Showbury Girls, where she qualified as a teacher and later went to Hilltown as well as Fort Hare University. Now, we'll know Fort Hare University at the time was a prominent university that had students from across the continent, not just South Africa. And so she graduates with a BA degree. And at the time, of course, there weren't a lot of women who were graduating with degrees. And so she was really quite part of a small group of women at that time, and begins teaching at Amanzimtoti Institute, which is in KwaZulu-Natal. And that's also along the coast, up along the coast from the Eastern Cape. And at the time, it was called the Natal Colony. And she teaches there. And she teaches, the area was mostly, well, it's a Zulu area by and large. And Amanzimtoti was one of the missionary schools there, a prominent missionary school that educated many of the people who would end up getting involved in African nationalism. And so in 1935, I begin there in terms of her public life, because that's where she begins to get quite featured quite prominently. But the newspaper itself, the Bantu World, was established in 1932. And so she appears in this newspaper. And in January, there's an article about her that celebrates her life as a teacher and a writer. And she had been writing for this newspaper as well. And later that year, there was a publication that was titled The Emancipation of Women. That was a speech that she had made at Inanda Seminary. And Inanda Seminary is one of the oldest missionary girls' schools, which has survived to present day, which is unlike the other missionary schools. So Showbury Girls, Amanzimtoti, Hilltown were all closed down by the apartheid government when Bantu education began. And Inanda Seminary is one of those that didn't close down and still exists today. And an American scholar, Megan Healy Clancy, has written the history of that institution and why, in fact, it survives. And so she also spent some time at Lovedale College, and Lovedale is back in the Eastern Cape. And it's around this time that she then meets and marries Christopher Chisosongole. And for those in the room who will have more context, Christopher Chisosongole is a Ugandan who Pumla Ngozwana was his second wife. He already had a wife who had passed away, and so had gone to South Africa effectively to look for a wife. And this wasn't unusual at the time, because there were many of the Fort Hare graduates were marrying South African women, and some of them were coming to Uganda as nurses. So this wasn't an unusual thing in that context. In fact, there's been an article about a cohort of nurses, South African nurses, who moved to Uganda around this time and around independence time. So she meets Christopher Chisosongole, whom she met through two of her friends, Professor Z.K. Matthews and Frida Matthews. Professor Z.K. Matthews was the first BA law graduate in South Africa. He became quite prominent in the ANC and traveled and I think studied at the London School of Economics, traveled and worked for the UN, and I think at some point was an ambassador in Botswana, or an ambassador for Botswana around Seretse Khama's time. So you're also getting a sense of the kind of circles that she is moving in. And then when you start seeing the question mark, so in this timeline that I've created, and this is purely from the fragments that I have attempted to put together. There's also evidence of her studying in England after she has married Chisosongole, and she does work as a community development officer. And I guess the key moment is in the 1950s, in 1956, when she's nominated onto the Legislative Council, and this is the pre-independence government. Around that time, she does work with the Mothers Union, and there's a group called the Young Wives Group, Rebecca Molera, Mrs. Kalema, Mrs. Eseza Mukimbi, Barbara Sabin, Catherine Hasty, and Winifred Brown, who were quite prominent and public. And one of the things that they do is to organize around the Kabaka's exile around that time. So, and around the 40s, the Ugandan Council of Women was also being established. I think it was established in 1942. And when she moves to Uganda, she joins the Uganda Council of Women, and she later becomes the president in 1957 until 1960. And it's because of her involvement in the Uganda Council of Women that she is nominated onto the Legislative Council. Together with Mrs. Serendipity is the second woman, and a few years later, I think by 1958, Mrs. Joyce Mbanga, the late Mrs. Joyce Mbanga, is also part of that. And so it's not very clear to me then what happens, what starts to happen as things change in Uganda. So by 1959, she's also the president of the International Council of Women, which is striking given her presidency in the Ugandan Council of Women. And at independence, she's appointed by Prime Minister Milton Obote to be part of the delegation, Uganda's first delegation to the United Nations. So you really get a sense of not only is she moving in political circles, but she's also entrusted by the women in the Ugandan Council of Women to be part of that delegation. And there's, I use a lot of Eileen Murray Tripp's work, who writes a chapter about this period in Ugandan history. And this is when it then starts to get murky, because in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s, the gaps begin to appear, largely because things change in Uganda, particularly for the women's movement. By the time Idi Amin comes in, he creates the National Council of Women, which creates a lot of problem for the Ugandan Council of Women, because now all women's movements need to go through this National Council of Women. And there's a lack of independence given the dictatorship at the time. And so it's not clear to me how much of her work continues in Uganda. I've had conversations with people who met her in Swaziland at the time, Eswatini, in the 1980s. And some have said she was a refugee. Some have said she worked as a consultant for UNESCO, and I'm still trying to piece together some of that work. And so far, I've managed to find that she was a consultant for the World Confederation of Organizations of the Teaching Profession, coordinating the International Women's Year, and that was in the 70s. And then in the 80s and 90s, it's not clear to me where she is and or how much work she's still doing. And according to the Daily Monitor, I think she passes away and is buried here in Uganda in the mid-90s. So that's the life of this person, and that's the biography that I've tried to piece together. So given that, I thought it would be nice to just play a short clip from the archives. And it's weird because there are a lot of these kind of colonial videos, and many that I found, she kind of appears in the periphery, like this one you'll see. And in others, she's in the wedding picture of the Kabakas, the wedding of the Kabaka, which you'll see. She's in the portrait, the family portrait. Oh, and the reason why this is significant. So Christopher Chisosongole had two daughters already, Sarah and Damali. And Damali marries the Kabaka, and they both have children with the Kabaka. And so she effectively becomes the grandmother of the mother-in-law of the Kabaka and the grandmother of the current Kabaka. So I hope the sound will be okay. Let's see. Oh dear. Okay, everything is up here. Should I just check the settings again? Where should we check? Oh, here, it's going to be this audio output device. So I don't know how we would. You know what? It's fine. The sound isn't the most important. I can kind of ad lib. What you'll be interested to see is that she appears in there. I'll still play it because I tried to change the settings here. Okay, you want to try? Okay, let's try. Oh, do I switch off here?
Want some time?
Could I ask if the online audience could hear us, hear the video?
Yes, it
Now
came a
we
little
can
bit.
hear. Now it's on, but it had a larger part had passed.
Sorry about that. Let's try it again from the beginning.
No, we couldn't hear the video.
We want some time. If you keep the it. Great rejoicing in Kampala on the day of the wedding of the King of Buganda, which, however confusing it may sound, is a province in Uganda. Hundreds of guests and spectators attended the festivities, and before the ceremonies began, Edward Mutesa II, the Kabaka, or king, walked and chatted with many of his subjects. There was some last-minute advice from, well, could it be his future mother-in-law? And the service in the Cathedral Church of St. Paul at Namirembe was conducted by the Anglican Bishop of Uganda. The bridesmaids arrived with the bride. She is Miss Catherine Damali Kiso-Sonkoli, the daughter of an ex-secretary of the native parliament. Like the Kabaka, she received part of her education in Britain. Incidentally, the majority of the Baganda people are Christian. The Kabaka and his bride, leaving the cathedral after the ceremony, were greeted by plenty of real African music. One of the drums, by the way, is said to be 400 years old. There was a reception at the palace where bride and groom acknowledged congratulations and loyal greetings from subjects and guests. Everything on this occasion followed the British pattern, even to the wedding cake. And here's the final scene, the departure of the royal pair for their honeymoon at the new palace of Bulemezi. Ideas for Christmas.
Okay, thank you. Oh, are you good? Okay. Thank you for the technical assistance. I'm going to go back, but I won't play the video this time. So what I found striking about this video is her appearance, right? And this mention of the mother, could that be the mother-in-law of, and it was the first time for me to get another visual representation of her. And what I really enjoy is her kind of being in there in the forefront. She's quite chatty and forward. So it now kind of gives me a personality to this person. Oh dear. I don't want, okay. So far with what I have, this is the kind of tentative book outline I'm working with. I want to begin from the moment at which I encounter her in 1935, which is not ordinary for a biography. I don't want to start, she was born on such and such a date, because I'm a literary person. I think chronology, not that chronology is not important. I think I want to stay true to this spirit of encounter and the spirit of this is how I make sense of the story, which is part of what is in this chapter as well. So I'm going to begin with 1935 and really want to do a deep dive into the implications of that speech and the publication of it, the emancipation of women, because for me, that sets the tone, and it makes sense then that she would be the president of the Uganda Council of Women, that she would be the president of another international council of women. And so for me, it makes a sense of the framing, because often when we write about these figures, when we see the work that they do internationally, it's almost as though the international world is responsible for their politics or their thinking. And I want to say, no, these are ideas that were formed in her before she even got involved in broader politics. And I think the other thing about that speech in 1935 is to also think about the kind of the public world in which she's already part of in South Africa. And so by the time she comes to Uganda and she moves to all these other places and gets involved in other international settings, she comes with a foundation in a public life. And so when you do see her right there in the wedding party chatting to the Kabaka, she's used to being in a public life. She's used to being part of public conversations. She's used to being part of significant moments in a sense. And then thanks to the Bantu Woman on the Move feature that was also in the same newspaper, which is where I began, is then to get a sense of reimagining her early life. There's mention of her father, who was a reverend, and there are missionary archives in South Africa that I'm going to look into that perhaps would have more details about her father and her mother. And then I want to talk about this. I'm imagining a chapter about tracing her through, gosh, my typos, through, not trough, biographical fragments, because what became interesting is that I began to pick up her names from other sources or from other people's memoirs and autobiographies, which is an interesting way for me to kind of think about how we the intuition of the archive. So apart from the newspaper archive, there was then this gap, and then I began reading other people's biographies. Particularly, the person who helped me the most was making the connection that she was friends with Frida Matthews through another article that Frida Matthews herself had written in the Bantu World, where the two of them are in a picture together. And then I found Frida Matthews's biography, and it was a short paragraph. And then I remembered there was another biography by Ellen Kuzwayo, who became a prominent apartheid activist, who writes about being taught by Frida Matthews. And then in the next paragraph, which I'd read the book many years ago. In the next paragraph, she describes being taught by Miss Ngozwana. And now it made sense to me that they were talking about this person. And so that's been the process. And there've been at least about 5 to 10 biographical fragments. And in a sense, and this is something a few people have started getting into, of thinking about memoir or life writing or autobiography as a history making process, and not just writing about one individual person's life. And that's a chapter that I'm working on for another project, but parts of it will appear in the book in this way. And then this process of moving to Uganda, the women's movement, the family dynamics, and the public life. And I guess what's also interesting about those three things, the women's movement, the family, and the public life, is also thinking about it in relation to in relation to the friends that she's kept, the friends that she's able to keep, able to make when she moves to Uganda. The interview that I had with Mrs. Mbanga earlier this year started giving me a sense of some of the connections between the woman in the Young Wives Club, Young Wives group, but as well as the way Mrs. Mbanga described her was a sense of someone who had mentored her because she was a few years older. Mrs. Kalema says she was in the same year as the daughters, or went to school around the same time as one of the daughters, and was friends with one of the daughters. So again, this kind of elder or mother figure to then the woman who become the founding mothers of a post-independence Uganda. And what is that connection, and how do we read that kind of generational connection between the women who are still alive one way or the other, but then begin to get more prominent in Uganda's public life in the 60s going forward. And then I'm still struggling with these troubled years and what happens during the Obote and Amin years, because there is a lot of silence in terms of how we read those years. And I have a hunch that, it's already been confirmed that there is this time Eswatini, but I have a hunch that she perhaps leaves the country. And then there are all these transnational traces. I've managed to find interviews of her in Paris in the late 60s. There's an article where she appears in the US around that time. And then, of course, this connection, Eswatini, which I'm trying to follow up on. And then, of course, coming back to Uganda, and what happens coming back to Uganda in that process is the reinstatement of the Kabaka. I think it's in the 80s. And what was the extent of her role in that process, if at all, given her position as the mother-in-law to the previous Kabaka, or Kabaka Mutesa I. And then the conclusion, which is today's paper, where I want to speak about the methodology and the process of coming to this. And I think why I want it to be the conclusion is particularly because no biographer really wants to center themselves in the story, but it's that sense of there is something about the stories that we choose at the beginning of the process and at the end of the process. And I want to think about methodology at the end of the process, because the habit, I guess, is to write in a particular order. And so kind of staying true to the spirit of a narrative is that then the kind of, so what, why would I do this kind of book? And the reason why I'm writing that chapter now, which is counterintuitive, because one writes, we think you're going to write from the very beginning, is because that's what's happening right now. I'm in the process of figuring out, why on earth am I doing this project? Why would I go to another country and try and figure out that country's history in order to be able to then go to the beginning and then write that story again? Okay, so maybe I'll stop sharing for a moment and just read some of the extracts from the paper and speak to some of the sections that I won't get to. And so I'm going to assume that the abstract has been read, but it's effectively trying to answer this question of why would I do research on this person? Why is this person even significant, even in spite of the biographical narrative that I've shared today? So, okay, I'm just going to read it as it is, and maybe I'll just only get to the introduction and the conclusion so we can perhaps open it up. Yeah. So I can't quite remember when I began to make meaning of Pumla Ngozwana's name as a name I wanted to explore further and build a story around. It may have been while reading Megan Healy Clancy's A World of Their Own, where she refers to Ngozwana's speech at Inanda Seminary, and I'm quoting from Megan here. Inanda was the site of a 1935 address by recent Forte BA Pumla Ngozwana on the emancipation of women, which laid out the core vision of new African womanhood. Ngozwana described her generation thus: although in primitive Bantu society, woman was free in that she was given her own sphere in which she moved and was her own mistress, in the new Bantu woman realized that there was not sufficient scope for her to develop. Now, she said, the Bantu woman, on account of her opportunities, has not attained to the same standard as her Negro and white sisters, but in spite of that, she too has shown the world what she can do. Before the emancipation of women, whoever heard of a woman leaving her home and going about giving lectures? And I guess the use of Bantu there at the time was referring to Black in the South African context, and Negro there is referring to African Americans, or we refer to as African Americans now, because the Bantu world was quite interested in this transnational conversation between using African American experience as the kind of standard for and people like Professor Ndongela Masilela write about the new Negro movement and the implications that it had in South Africa. And it was by and large because of the travel, people like John Dube traveling and meeting Booker T. Washington, the AME Church, which became quite prominent in South Africa, which had connections with African American institutions and has a history through people like Charlotte Maxeke. So there's this conversation about Negro women and the club movements, and the idea of the clubs in the African American context making their way into South Africa through people like Lillian Chabalala and Daughters of Africa. So there are these conversations that she's drawing on in that speech, and it's a much longer piece, but that's just an extract from the speech itself. So I continue. The extract piqued my interest about the idea that in 1935, there were women not only thinking about women's emancipation, but making speeches about it too. My formative education had led me to believe that the only women who had been doing this were the suffragettes of England and not Black women in South Africa during the same period. According to my education, Black women in South Africa only began thinking about emancipation in the mid-20th century, which culminated in the Anti-Pass Women's March in 1956. And of course, absolutely nothing about Pan-African connections amongst women on the continent in the 20th century. It seemed to me there was a gap in my education about the stories of women. It was this speech which led me to the pages of the Bantu World newspaper where Ngozwana's speech was published. Writing this biography has left me thinking about the idea of being a story catcher. I borrowed this idea from South African artist Msaki, known as Sanda Lusaseni, who talks about being a song catcher rather than a songwriter. Songs come to her in an ethereal manner that is often hard to explain. Sometimes songs arrive in dreams, and she chooses to catch the song before it moves on. I feel the same about the poems I write and the history I am writing. I am learning to catch the words in the form of poetry before they move on or disappear. Sometimes I do not catch them fast enough. This practice of an intuitive sense of catching poems has helped me in catching the names of the women I write about. This was the case with Pumla Ngozwana. Her name kept appearing, and after a few appearances, my intuition told me, there's a story here. I have intentionally pursued what appeared as a small whisper as a way to honor the person who is behind the story. But equally, if there is a voice saying, there's a story here, it is possible to imagine that the women I write about choose me to write their stories. Much of what I've experienced in writing about Pumla Ngozwana has not been a cerebral academic project. There are parts of the journey I may never be able to put into words and may never be published. There are experiences which represent an academic project, but there's more to the story I may never fully grasp, and I'm okay with that. Even while I have mapped out the journey of the context of an academic book, it is important for me to mention the role intuition plays in the choices I have made in my academic projects. I'm using serendipity to explain the ways in which being at the right place at the right time has implications for the possibilities of a story unfolding. The convergence of time and place has the ability to allow or disallow something that otherwise would not have happened. Serendipity is about choices and opportunities presenting themselves in an already moving sequence of events. My role in this research has been about responding to these events and being ready and willing to become part of an already evolving story. Part of this willingness is the ability to show up for the opportunities and recognize them as significant and not simply circumstantial. Paying attention is at the heart of serendipity because it is attention which makes it possible to recognize connections when they happen. And so I write about the process of making sense of the Bantu Woman on the Move feature, which initially I wrote a longer paper about because there were 4 or 5 other women that were featured that year under this a feature called Bantu Women on the Move. And in the longer book, I'll go into a bit more depth of what it means to be a writer or appearing in the Bantu world itself. And then I write about the just like the practical stuff. So it was at the end of my PhD journey. In fact, when I was preparing for this chapter, I went back to the first time I sent the kind of a 4-page, 5-page book proposal to someone. And it was right at the beginning of, I think it was February 2020. I had submitted my PhD January 2020. And in spite of my supervisor saying, stop, race, you don't need to do anything else. You're allowed to stop. I was like obsessed with writing this book proposal. And the reason at the time was a colleague at UJ was putting together a group of people who were working in biographical projects. So I was sharing this with him. And the idea had been that there could possibly be some funding. And so this was way before kind of COVID comes onto the scene and shuts all of us down. I had started making plans to come to Uganda, but having no sense of where to even begin. But there was a sense of I should go to Uganda if this person passed away there, and kind of work my way backwards into maybe I have a thing about working backwards. I really like starting at the end. Why start in the place where she ended up is kind of, now that I think of it, a bit of a weird logic. But anyway, I do that. And one way of doing that is just trying to think about who understands this context the best. And at the time, I had no sense of what the Chisosongoles mean in the Ugandan public sphere. So I'm just thinking, oh, she just married into a family. And it was through conversation. So the first person I have a conversation with was a friend who I met through a scholarship program, and she's Ugandan. And I said, hey, friend, I'm interested in this project. How do I go about it if I want to go to Uganda? And then she introduced me to someone who lives here in Uganda, who then started painting the picture. She was like, Chisosongole, they've got royal connections. You can't just rock up there and start asking them questions. And of course, you would think at that point, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't do this project. It's going to be too difficult. And that's when I became really interested. And then lockdown happened because the conversation and the person I write about, she's KC, the person kind of gives me this picture and starts sending me articles, and I began to get a sense of the social life that she would have married into. But then, of course, because it's COVID, things lose momentum. There's no sense of when the world is going to open up again. And so I kind of get lost in figuring out teaching online. And so the project lies dormant for another year. And then it's only, I think, a year later when things are starting to open up that I reconnect with another friend. And now I'm too embarrassed at this point to go back to this person who was giving me this context, because I think the last email she sent me, and when I looked, it was like a year later. I was like, oh my gosh, they probably don't even remember me and they think I'm a flake. So I leave that thread dry, and then I reconnect with a childhood friend. We grew up in the same city or town, rather. East London is a town. And she's telling me about she's about to move to France, and she works for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And I'm like, oh, wait, maybe you can help me. Is there someone who works in the East Africa region who could help me make inroads into this world? And she connects me with someone who then connects me with the South African High Commission office here. And when that happened, I was like, oh my gosh, why is this? Because as a researcher, you don't really think you need to go to that extent. And that, in fact, was the door that I needed to open, because it was only through that connection that helped me get to the Buganda Kingdom, that helps me kind of get more, like I got a list of people to contact all of a sudden after having, I did a desktop research of like, what is the Buganda Kingdom, and you don't know who to actually contact when you see all you see the Katikiro, you see all the people listed on the website, like who's going to answer my email, which is something I had tried with the first person who we had conversations about. So it's that connection point. And what was significant for me in that connection point is, as a regular researcher as an average person in the street, getting access to the South African High Commission in another country doesn't just happen. It's the fact that I was friends with someone who then worked. And so even those kind of, and for me, the reconnecting with this, and she said I could use her name. And when I edit this, I'm going to add her name. Reconnecting with this friend of mine, Ulihle, makes it possible because we grew up together, because we're part of this network of people who know each other. And so she can introduce me to her colleagues, and her colleagues will like me because they like her. So there's like this thing about networks making our research available, and your name carrying through somebody else who says, please help this person to get to the next step, to get to the next step. And I think that's what I mean as a way of serendipity, of reconnecting with Lisa at that particular time was also what made this research possible. And so then when the borders started opening, I planned my first trip, which was July last year. You're going to give me a sense of when I should start wrapping up, yeah? Are you still good? Okay. Okay, cool. And so I planned this trip, and I planned a really short trip. And this is after I've been given details through the South African High Commission, and made tentative, it's not even made tentative appointments, because it was also that sense of like, how do you make appointments with people who've never met you before? And that's why it was important for me to come, because sending emails, we all know how that is. People can or cannot respond to them. So I felt it was important to come here. And one of the most obvious kind of serendipitous moment for me upon arriving was, and the backstory is, my supervisor, her name is Linda Spencer, grew up in Uganda. And I didn't know the extent of this when I first met her. She was just a lecturer at Rhodes University whom I knew and liked and met through a friend. And so she becomes my lecturer, and I start telling her about the story about Ngozwana. And, you know, she's like, okay, cool. Sounds like a great post-PhD project. Good luck, kind of thing. And obviously we're still in touch. The PhD, we're still wrapping up corrections. So when I tell her about this trip in July coming to Uganda, she introduces me to her cousin, a family that stays here in Uganda. And I'm like, okay, cool, great, thank you. And that was just the cousin offered to take me shopping and to introduce me to her mum. Wonderful. So on the day she's picking me up to go meet the mum, I had gone to Aristoc to buy a copy of Mrs. Kalema's book. And the other thing about the books is all the books that I've managed that have been central to me understanding Uganda, none of them are available in South Africa. So that was probably the other reason I needed to come to Uganda, was that I would have never found Mrs. Kalema's book. I would have never found Mrs. Ndiro's book. I would have never found, there's another book about the Queen Mother. I would have never found Professor Mutibwa's books. I would have never found all these books that are central if you're going to understand this world that this person lives in and understands. And so I have my copy of Mrs. Kalema's book, and I'm trying to explain to the cousin the research. And as I show her the book, she says, oh, Mrs. Kalema, that's my god aunt. I was like, or my godmother. Like, what are you talking about? She's like, yes, this is mum's friend. So we go and meet mum, and she's wonderful. And she like gets on the phone, oh, Dad, there's a South African here who'd like to meet you. And that I was just like, in what world do you buy a book, meet the person on the same day that you bought them, explain their project, and they're like, okay, cool, come back on Monday and we can have a chat. And that was like a turning point for me in the research, because I was like, even if I find this one person, I would still be able to write a book, because there's something so fascinating about how small the network is, but the fact that I'm also talking about this research, and the fact that people are interested enough to say, oh yes, this is a family friend, you can go say hello to her. And so that's how I end up meeting Mrs. Kalema. And really at that point, I was like, there's also nothing more nerve-wracking when you get email addresses and phone numbers of people you don't know, and then you have to pick up the phone and you have no reference point. And by and large, part of this, and when I extend the chapter and ask for more permissions, is the ability to say, hi, I'm so-and-so, friends of so-and-so. And then people will actually listen, and then they'll give you the time, or make whatever formalities a lot easier, which I think is important in, I think, context where research has to be done. So yeah, that was like the kind of opening point of this. And I was able to meet Mrs. Kalema, and I was able to record the conversation. And one of the things, and maybe I'll end off here and speak to a few more things, and was this document that she had. So if you can imagine someone like Mrs. Kalema, a living archive, who has documented this country. Her life and world is full of these books that have documented this. And it just so happened that there was a publication that had another picture kind of confirming Mrs. Chisosongole's life. And I switched between calling her Ngozwana and Mrs. Chisosongole because at any point she's both those people. And that's another trouble of the book in terms of avoiding confusion. And it had this publication and it had a picture of her presenting at an event. And it was a moment for both Mrs. Palem and I scanned the publication. It was from the Forum for Women in Democracy, which was a collection of photographs from 2002. There'd been an exhibition in 2002. I would have never found that document in South Africa because certain documents don't travel in the same way. So a lot happened in that first week in July. I came back again in January this year, and that's when I was able to meet Mrs. Mbanga. And of course, I mean, I'm also interviewing people in their 90s who are still so incredibly sharp and they have a memory and they know who you're talking about was also just so mind-blowing for me. And so having those two conversations in such a short period of time was another kind of turning point or the kind of momentum I needed to say, okay, this is something that can actually work. And then I came again in August, which is when I met Prof. Susan. But at that point, I was just presenting on just the kind of biographical work. And that's when I met Edgar as well. But I think we had emailed each other before. Yes, it was after that conference, but someone else had connected us in January after the Princeton workshop, which is another serendipitous moment about people I met there, which I won't go into now, but I go into in the chapter. And the transnational connections, because then there's this other world. So I've since discovered that there is a daughter who is still alive but lives in England. I would have never discovered that if someone who lives in England and happens to have a friend who's a friend of the daughter see my name on a program of a workshop that took place in Princeton, where I was presenting on the chapter. So there's this whole other international archive or international trails that I'm now trying to make sense of in terms of how to go about this research. And I guess the kind of where all of these connections lead to and what perhaps is the historical argument for all of this is that, of course, well, so what? Everyone has connections. Everyone has nice people who meet them. And maybe I'll just read this part just not to waffle, and then I think I'll stop there. So what? One might argue that there is nothing unusual in the connections I have mapped out in this reflection. If I were to use these threads to formulate an argument about the nature of historiography and the process of writing histories, I would argue that the myth of the singular author sitting alone, writing or poring over documents needs to be seen in relation to the network and communities which surround them and enable them to have that time alone. The quality of what happens in those moments of seclusion are directly linked to the connections with other people who have a vested interest in the project, as well as a vested interest in the individual researcher's well-being. In a sense, knowledge production is community work. It is a process of co-creation. The ways in which our work as researchers circulates has implications for what is possible in our research. My invitation to the workshop at Princeton meant that 3 connections were possible, which ordinarily may not have been possible in previous years. This circulation has implications for how my work is received, but also the opportunity to share resources with others who have come across threads that are relevant to my work. Even while the common rant about academics is that we are petty and cagey and at times selfish, I have been at the receiving end of people's largesse and generosity in ways that contradict the common perception about academics, which is to say, knowledge production cannot happen without generosity and goodwill for each other. This question of circulation also has implications for how archives are organized and what we imagine are colonial archives, African archives, etc. The transnational collections I have established thus far, and with previous research related to another figure, Noni Jabavu, who has interesting connections in Uganda, has taught me that African archives are not simply African archives. There's a vested interest in them all over the world. The question of location and access are perhaps the crux of the political questions which emerge when talking about what belongs where and with whom, and who are the rightful custodians of any archive. It would be remiss of me not to speak about circulation in relation to money. Getting a grant in order to make this work possible is also a question of paying attention. Academics are now in a context where we are constantly looking for grants and fundraising for our projects and our students. We are forced to pay attention to opportunities that will help us get the archives we need, attend conferences where we can circulate our work and become part of intellectual communities. And this is not always easy. The grant I had received for this work has enabled my ability to be in Uganda multiple times in order to get a sense of the zeitgeist for the kind of research I am doing, and in the process form friendships and collegiality which may yield future work. It is resources that allows us the opportunity to continue making sense of the work we do and keep us moving towards forming connections rather than remaining in our silos. These connections are all wrapped up in the figure whose life I am attempting to write. In isiXhosa, we have a saying about umsebenzi ufana nomntu wawo, which loosely translates to someone's work mirrors who they are. Pumla born Ngozwana, lived a peripatetic life. There are connections in France and North America I'm still in the process of uncovering and making sense of, which suggests that the process of writing her story will require some movement and connections in the same way the life of the subject had movement and cross-border connections. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. And I'll just now hand over to our discussant, Professor Chiguli, who, as I said, is from the Department of Literature. And I don't know if she would want me to say, but just have to say that recent recipient of Lifetime Achievement Award from the Vercelli Seminar, is that the organization? It was really wonderful achievement. So we're very honored to have you as the discussant today. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Athambile. Thank you for this privilege to discuss your work. I was very excited when I was requested to discuss this work. Basically, this may sound petty, but because this work was on a figure that I've had so much about, but never have been able to see a whole book or a whole project on her. But also that you are a female researcher was doing this work was very interesting for me. I have put a few things together to say on the paper. So because it's very, very rich work, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart. So it's very genuinely extremely dense and exciting work. I found problems choosing what to say and what not to say. But since I've been given 10 minutes, I can have an excuse of just saying a few things I have down. So in my view, the construction or making and reconstruction or even remaking of the figure whose name always comes frequently in local narratives about Ugandan women leaders as a transgressor, transformer, and active participant in questioning the political, social, and cultural order is phenomenal. I think this work is phenomenal. It's huge work in terms of what it means symbolically, even just at the level of symbol. So it is reading and listening to your work that it has then dawned on me that this name is so familiar, yet not enough is known about the full experience or life and role of this figure, either here in Uganda, where she's much talked about, or in South Africa, from what you say. And so this was going on in my mind. It's something that it seems to happen to phenomenal female figures in Africa, especially because you may have other figures elsewhere that's with female figures, but phenomenal, but a lot is known. But here it's we talk about these people a lot. But when it comes to actually finding maybe book projects about them, it's very hard. And I have a few ideas about why that happens, but maybe we will discuss that a bit more later. So I'm interested in this paper very much because it is a lot for me. Maybe I'm approaching it as a literary scholar, but it's a lot to the positioning and excavating of narratives to show the presence of Black women's activity and thought about women's roles and experiences, especially in our context, now in the African context. I'm very interested because of that. So for me, it's not only because it's piecing together history, but it's piecing together stories that, as you said, involve not just Pumla Sosonkole, but so many other women. And it's almost like piecing together the history in a different way of the women movement in Uganda, and maybe we'll loop in what happens from where she came from, South Africa. So names like Rhoda Kalema, Joyce Mpanga, as coming together together in this. So that's one of the things that makes it very interesting for me. I'm enthusiastic too, enthusiastic about its deep and thoughtful exploration of research methodology and how research methods are shifting and perhaps unstable and can be driven by the researcher, by the subject, by the place and time of research. And I knew that these things are important, but I didn't see how so connected as this paper has made it. I think this is such an important research methodology paper. And when I first read through the paper, I was interested in, there's so many names. There were, of course, abbreviations, but there were so many. There were so many. It was like a web of people together. And I think this is extremely interesting in terms of how we think about research, how we think about retrieving information. So there are a number of notions that come up in this paper that I want to quickly note because I have 10 minutes. The first one is the notion of being a story culture by artist Misaki Asanda Lusaseni. I think this notion is extremely important for this paper and even beyond this paper and for the biography project, because for me it encapsulates the idea of retrieval and recovery of narrative, especially in this case of a well-known figure in our context, to whom we refer to frequently, but perhaps fleetingly. So this idea to me is significant and central to the concept of biography and historiography because it foregrounds the idea of constructing and reconstructing a whole story with important details not available before. And in this case, it brings to the center South African and Ugandan women's role in transnational and cross-cultural concerns in the struggle against gender inequality and also their attempt to privilege women's voices. This notion for me revolves around the fact that the story is present. Pumla Sosonkole's story is present and even somewhat extremely visible, like you told me in a conversation, said, oh, there are so many pieces written, but there is no concerted, brought together effort to catch the story, even when the figure, if we think of a female storyteller, is a dominant one. Yeah. So for me, perhaps this may be where one needs to think and develop this in more detail, because we have this whole female figure of a female storyteller, the custodian of tradition. And so actually, in the way that is Pumla's Kisosonkole's life has unfolded, it's like she's talked about, people talk about her orally. The moment you talk about Pumla Kisosonkole, I think women's movement, but the details of how she went about her life, the connections she made, seem to be in our orature. But as you know, my concern is this. I think the oral story is not being as actively complemented by the written one as it should actually be. Should be. Yet in this hybrid context in which we operate, and sometimes surrounded by conflict, war, or even abolition of specific institutions, this kind of project is much needed. We cannot, I think what you're doing is so important, because we cannot continue to just leave our information in oral archives. As much as we respect oral archives, I come from literature, so orature is central to how we think. But I think that it's important what you're doing to see the oral and to see all the other things scattered in different journals and whatever, and other archives, to see how we can harness and be able to say we are living in a hybrid situation, whether we like it or not. We're living in a situation in Uganda where orality is extremely important, but also where writing is important. So we have to write and also tell our stories. And I think this was very important, this notion of the story culture. And I think that it shouldn't only stay in the conclusion, but it's, although actually what is, from how you discuss, it seems it's a notion that you mentioned in the conclusion, but it's the notion that drives the work. Yeah. Then your discussion of a notion of serendipity, which was very exciting for me, especially when I met you at the late Honorable Joyce Mpanga's funeral. I thought this is real serendipity. The discussion of the notion of serendipity as being about choices and opportunities in an already moving sequence of events highlights the agency of a storyteller, the importance of response to events, as well as the willingness to reflect, analyze, and assess, while aware of how time and place work together to construct and even subvert meanings and stories. This makes the idea of attention very important. And the idea of attention is so very tied to the idea of serendipity. And I thought that was very fascinating, and that this idea is very important to what you're doing, to the work you're doing. So attention, as you point out, attention to opportunity, attention to place, attention to networks, attention to time. And I think that the students that are doing doctoral work should have a bit more time with you in these things, because attention is at the very center of research. I knew this, but your paper brings it out so strongly. Attention to little details, attention to someone's welcoming smile, attention to someone's discomfort, about attention to things that can move the research or can stay the research. Attention to things like COVID just happening, and then you keeping the research for a year and losing a connection, right? So I thought that the idea of attention and the idea of serendipity were very important to research methodology, even beyond what you are doing. This brings me to a number. I also appreciated, and I'll be wrapping up, Edgar. I also appreciated the idea of knowledge production as a process of community work and co-creation. I had not, I mean, I am a student of performance studies, so I wrote about the idea of communitas and all these things, but your discussion brought it out even more because it was so, I could see community X with Y, with you having a cousin, your supervisor having a cousin here, she sends you here, the whole connection, you in South Africa and Uganda. I never knew South Africa and Uganda were so connected. I know in some way, but I see how so connected we are. We are even connected to your president's family. Don't joke with us. No, this brings me, I appreciated this idea because even though African researchers, this is our direct experience, this idea of serendipity, this idea of attention to detail, but it's not in my estimation given enough attention. And I think I'm thinking of this paper beyond even your project, thinking of how useful it is to our students. How this for you may be just small tips, but this is huge in terms of how it could help our students get on in their methodology, and not students only of history, students of, I thought, oh, my students need this paper. My students need to hear this. My students need a session with Dr. Masola, just talking about how you go about research, how you retain connections. Now, this brings me to just a few short questions. I usually ask many questions, but this time your paper is so involving. I'm just asking a few questions to you. So in this discussion and reflection on a research journey, the ideas of intuition, attention, collaboration, participation, cooperation, and community are key. Whether you mention them or you don't, they just keep leaping out in the paper. I'm curious about them because they resonate with a number of scholars' discussions of how African women in general operate. To what degree are these ideas dominant in this research because you are a female researcher, carrying out research on a well-known female African figure? Then the second question. How is this biography project going to handle issues of reconstructing, writing and rewriting identity, especially shifting identities between private, public, cross-culture, and this cross-culture is very sensitive here, cross-culture and transnational spaces? I would like to hear a little bit more about this, if possible. Then the third question is, in this research, in the discussion of your research methodology, I wanted to know a little more. Why has the work of Pumla, Ngozwana, Kisosonkole not found its way in a book project up to now from your own? I know you got interested and you started working, but in your conversations and in your thinking, why is this so? I'm interested because I was wondering whether it has anything to do with gender, whether it has anything to do with her being a transnational figure, like you point out. I wasn't very sure. And the last one, I promise there will be very few. The last one is, why did you use, and I even saw in your use a conversational tone in writing a paper that is on research methodology? Edgar, thank you so very much. I have so many other things to ask, because also gender, even when this is a research methodology, gender was just screaming at me in different ways. But for the moment, let me leave it there and see what you think. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those really great comments and questions. Just as many or as much as you want to respond to, and after that we'll open up to the floor, if that's all right. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prof. Yeah, few but very sharp and challenging questions. I think I'll start with the last one. Again, my backwards thing. You know, I think most of my academic work is written in a conversational tone. And at times I have struggled a bit with this, but I think more and more, and maybe it is to this gender question that you keep alluding to, because of how we enter academia, a lot of the writing we read has been, and in our context, old white men who didn't write with people like us in mind. And I think there is an argument about, and I often say this to my students who are quite daunted by writing, is that write in the way that you speak. You can make it flowery maybe later, but I think it's a question of access. So can I access it, me, the person who is writing it? And it's that, as selfish as that is, that I'm writing it for myself, I need to understand it. But I also think in this particular one, it is the way that it, like, relational work is conversational work. So I'm writing about relationships. And so it makes no sense. I mean, I can add theory, and maybe I will. A friend of mine sent me two pieces about kind of anecdotes as a form of research, and the other one research as a slow process, and some of it speaks to this. So I think it's a shift in academic discourse that says, if we are going to decolonize, if we are going to do African research, if we are going to shape and reshape the ways in which things have always been done as gatekeeping, because sometimes I'll read something, I myself will read, I'm like, who is this person writing for? Like, why would you use this word when you can use this word and we'll all understand? So there's something about academic writing which is intentionally about obscuring. So I think that's part of it. But I think it also lends itself to what has happened, is that these are relationships. And so even the people who I write about, if I gave them this chapter, would they be able to enjoy it, access it? And maybe the other three questions I'll try, just in the interest of time. Why has she been so peripheral? And this question of the public and the private, and my own positioning. And the question of my own positioning, I've been writing about since the first paper that I wrote, where I include her. And there is something quite interesting. I mean, sometimes people are like, is it because you're from the same region that you write about her? Now, we don't only ever write about the people who are familiar to us, but I think there is something about my positioning as a young female academic, that this kind of work gravitates towards me. But it is something about retrieval, is that if we have been absent from the research for such a long time, then we're the ones who are going to see that we've been absent and then do the work of putting ourselves or putting people who look like us back into the narrative. And you're absolutely right, that she falls out. So another transnational figure, maybe let me answer it this way. Another transnational figure who was the gateway into this research is Noni Jabavu. Noni Jabavu sister married also Muganda during the whole kind of Uganda-South Africa matrimonial connections. And so writes a book, in fact, that she gets into a lot of trouble for by some Ugandans because she writes very stroppily about Uganda and her experience of coming here. But she was a transnational figure. She's born in South Africa. Her parents send her to a school in the UK when she's 13. She stays in the UK, marries. At some point, she's living in Jamaica. At some point, she's in Kenya. At some point, she's in London. At some point, she's in Uganda, etc. And she falls out. And I think we don't have a way of talking about the fact that if people move around a lot, we don't know how to write about them, or we don't know how to trace them, or we just kind of assume that they're kind of there. I mean, this person was the first in so many ways. She wrote books, so she herself wrote herself in, but people don't read her or don't see her. And I love this idea of fleeting and frequent, and I'm going to use it. It's just perfectly captures that way in which people fall through the cracks, which is the expression I've been using. So transnational figures who are not part of, and this is, I think, the problem with a lot of African nationalist histories, is that if people don't stick to the African nationalist narrative, and in our case, it's the ANC story. The ANC was established in 1912. This is what they did. They then went into exile. And if you're not part of that narrative, like, so the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, falls out. PAC has connections here in Uganda. The SACP falls out. The workers' movement sometimes falls out. And the ANC over time has tried, in their kind of narrative that they're building about themselves and their history, try to incorporate some of that. But I really do blame a nationalistic history. And I sometimes blame the fact that most of our history is political history. We don't do a lot of social history. We don't do a lot of intellectual history. And I think intellectual history is now coming back again. And I also want to situate her within that kind of intellectual social history. And she kind of brings all those worlds together. So maybe I'll pause there for me, but thank you.
So, thanks to our for this really great conversation so far, and I just want to open it up now to the audience for questions, both in the room and online. If you're online, either the raise hand button, or if you prefer, you can type something in the chat, and I'll call on you. So I now want to make the floor open to questions. I have my own, but I would prefer to ask others to join in first. Please go ahead. Just in the room, you'll have to use one of the microphones so the online people can hear. Yeah.
Hello, I hope I'm audible, not edible.
Actually, I always forget, maybe we introduce ourselves as we ask questions.
Okay, my name is Oese Oswan. I'm just a curious person who came here out of total curiosity because I've heard of this person that you've talked about, and I really would like to thank you so much for throwing more light on somebody that we've only heard about and barely knew anything about, but also to thank the good professor here for throwing more light again on the same issue. But now the question I have is this, and I've been curious about it for a while, because for me, I am an enthusiast for the unification of Africa. And I think things like that can possibly lead us in the general direction where we want to go. So I want to know, in the paper that you write about this person, do you also address any real ideological, I mean, in her history, is there actual ideas from her, what she thought about different things, how she handled different things? Because I imagine the cultural differences must have affected. And I want to know, because you mentioned the Bantu paper, and I know that the Baganda are also part of the entire Bantu establishment. I want to know, were there any cultural similarities that drew her to Uganda in specifically, and things like that? Thank you.
Would you like to take a couple at a time, or yeah? So David Cohen has his hand raised. David, you're welcome to unmute and ask the question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. That Athambile, that was just wonderful hearing and Professor Kiguli. Really beautiful comments. I had three things that I can say very shortly. I really see the power in looking into these lost paths where connections were ways of traveling, ways of working were doable, and we kind of lost sight of that. And connected to that is like this feeling that you were also navigating these same pathways as kind of a simulating and understanding some of the ways of that Pumla found her way into the next parts of her life and experienced a wider world. So I'm intrigued about that. I have a competing dog here who would like to talk with me. Excuse me. I guess the other thing that really is, I mean, everything about this engages me. But one that hasn't been mentioned, I think, is your reference to a public life. And it made me think, is like, how does a life become public? Or what are the conditions under which a life is seen to be public, and what does it mean to be able to say that? So that's what I have to say, and thank you for this project. It's really absolutely wonderful.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you for joining us. Maybe should we take one more question? And do you want to take a round of like three, and then yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm Anthony Kajimu, and I'm also curious walker into the discussion. I was taken back by the video where I see her walking with the king on the wedding day, and looking at it in the context of culture, within the strong Buganda culture, that was an unexpected image. We tend to keep quite a good distance from our mothers-in-law, and the ladies usually will keep a distance from their fathers-in-law. It's a long story of how it happens that way and whether it's appropriate. But ideally, it is not something, that's not the proximity and conversation you would have expected for the stature of a king within what we understand to be the cultural construct at the time. And it makes me think, what drives her to be able to do that and to fit into that space? And also, in what other ways is she able to approach and do things differently, perhaps by the liberty of being initially an outsider? I mean, thinking about the current king, it's an image I've never seen. Yet years have passed by and tradition has become more fluid. Yet I see a more fluid situation 50, 60 years in the past. Do you think it's because she's an outsider? And if so, in what other ways is she able to break boundaries or go beyond because she's initially from out?
You want to take those, and then we'll do another round after you. Yeah. So go ahead.
Wow, thank you everyone for those questions. Always say, absolutely. So the reason why I want to start with that emancipation of women is that I want to locate her within her ideas. And she has very clear ideas. And so far I've seen two. So the one is about women, right? And that filters throughout everything that she does. So if in 1935 she's saying the emancipation of women, when she becomes a member of the LegCo, there's this famous quote of hers about when someone makes it into a room, you put your foot in the door so that you let others pass through. And that's an ideological position about power. That's an ideological position about women keeping doors open for each other. So there's a very strong, and initially I thought, well, if I don't find a lot of information about her, and this can still be part of the project, is that this can be an intellectual biography, because I've managed to find a few other essays that she's written. And there's another essay that she writes about, and this is one, I should know the year because I gave it to my students for a course we've just finished. But she's writing about the presence of women in an international stage. So, of course, she herself is already in that stage, and I think it was published in the East Africa Journal. So she's writing about herself effectively, but saying, why is it important for women to participate at an international stage? That's in the 60s. And think about, have we regressed or have we been able to maintain that kind of vision about women being at all levels effectively? And then with the Bantu world, one of the reasons I also wanted to come here, and now someone has made it available, some resources available in soft copy, was getting access to newspapers like the Uganda Argus, where she appears a lot. And one of the debates that were in the LegCo was about education and about a free education. And she's quoted and talking about a free education for children. So those are ideological positions. And so I do definitely want to trace those, find as many, and in the interview, she became like a literacy advisor, and the interview that I mentioned with UNESCO. So those are 3 texts, I would say, that even if I didn't find anything else, I would still be able to write about. And you're absolutely right, to this fleeting and frequent mention of someone is that part of the challenge with how we write about our historical figures, especially if they're not the founding fathers whose ideas we can trace because they themselves write their own ideas, is we kind of end up, they were born here, they went to the school, they died here. And we never get to the kernel of what were they actually talking about. So thanks for crystallizing that. That's definitely going to be a thread. David, thank you. Hello, lovely to hear from you. Yeah, this question of a public life, you're absolutely right. And it's something I think I take for granted because it seems so apparent and obvious. But I'm in one of the, I think in or maybe it will filter throughout. It's something that I need to not take for granted so that it can be a strong argument in the book as well, is that one of the conditions of a public life, for me, it's her writing in the newspapers, it's her speaking in public places, it's her being in organizations, it's her constantly being in community. And so, I mean, even in that video, to Anthony's question, that's a public life. That the fact that she sees herself as having that kind of proximity, and perhaps here it's a public life that is proximate to power and understands her role as being proximate to power. But those conditions change over time, and that's why those 2 years of what I'm still reading as gaps at the moment is what happens to public life in a context of repression. What happens to a public life in a context of ideas not circulating as much. So, and I think it's one of the questions you were asking, when things change, the reconstruction and the identities change, is that you can go from being the mother-in-law of a Kabaka, but then the Kabaka is sent into exile. Are you still prominent? Are you still in public life when that happens? And what do you do with that shift in that time? So I think that's something I need to really map out, and maybe it will need its own chapter to really unpack what is a public life and how do you understand it through a historical figure and the conditions of that. Thank you for that video. And see, this is why we come, so that other people can point out, because I was like, oh, maybe she's just an eager beaver. I didn't think that there's a problem with her being that proximate to the king. And I don't know the protocols of how one can be proximate to the king. So that's another way I'm going to read that video and how to analyze that video, because someone could read that as she's being a busybody. And I mean, the commentary makes that kind of tongue-in-cheek comment, but he's also not even reading it in relation to the rules of the Buganda. And that's perhaps something I need to follow up on, to be like, what were the rules at the time about proximity between mother-in-laws? And because that's also before the wedding takes place. So why is she all up in the mix before? Because technically things haven't been quite combined, or there are always these rules about, I mean, we have rules about we have Nkusane, so even before the bride gets married, nobody is actually allowed to see them except for their they have to be in seclusion except for like them, the person who is their guardian effectively. So thank you for that. I'm gonna read that video very differently, and it's again about proximity. It's again about publicness. Is she there to show that she is the mother-in-law, or what else is she doing in that appearance for herself? Is she aware that she's been read that way? Is she aware that she's in that video? So thank you. That's you've just made me read it in a totally different ways. And maybe the liberties of being an outsider is that if you are an outsider, those shifting identities again, you can break the rules and people will allow you to break the rules. I've seen it already, me being a traveler here. People are so kind to me because they're like, she's a visitor. And maybe it is that kind of African sense of visitor. We'll pardon them. They'll pronounce our names wrong. I mean, for the longest time, I was going around saying Kiso Sonkole, and then everyone was saying Kisho Sonkole. I was like, are we talking about the same person? And now I know in Luganda, Ki is Chi. So now I'm not going to make that mistake again. But it is those liberties. And maybe there was another kind of affectation. Someone was telling me, I think it was Derek Peterson who I mentioned in the paper. There's a picture. So one of the things that happened, and I can't remember if it's when the Kabaka is deported or when the Kabaka goes into exile. There are protests. The women protest, and they're like a country without, or a people without their king, are effectively motherless. You've rendered all of us women in this kingdom precarious if our father of the nation is not with us. And so they do these protests, which is part of, one of them is done by the Young Wives Group, but there's a picture of her with Damali in this protest. So maybe it was also her ability to be proximate and to do these protests, because it was unheard of that a Kabaka could be deported in that way. And so what the woman's response is a very public response. People are not quiet when that happens. So yeah. Sorry, there was a bit of because I've just been thinking about it in a different way.
Yeah. Thanks. There are a few. Dr. Florence Abila is online. Dr. Abila, you're welcome to unmute and ask your question. Dr. Abila, can you? Yes.
Yes, I've unmuted. I was struggling to unmute. I'm using my phone. Thank you very much for a very exciting presentation, both the presenter and Susan for that discussion. As following here and just reflecting back on doing research on autobiography and on biography, and most of the things that Athambile talks about comes to mind here. If you're researching an international figure like Pumla Sonkole, what do you, where do you start and where do you stop? So the question of chronology, I really, that resonates with me. Historical studies will want you to fix and talk about things chronologically for us to understand in which year what happened. But sometimes there are so many shifts that you sometimes don't have the liberty to do that. But my question is, what history have you found about her life prior to coming to Uganda? I didn't hear that coming in your research. Is there any record beyond her university life? Which family did she grow up in? And that could also be important, much as we are not thinking about chronology here. Then secondly, the silences. You talk about the period when there's silence about her in the 1960s, 1970s. And then there's this opportunity for her granddaughter being in the UK. Are you planning to talk to her to find out what exactly happened during that period? I think that would also be crucial. And then thirdly, which is actually controversial for a feminist scholar like me to ask, is I want to think with you through this. In the women's movement, what is the significance of marriage to nationalism, to regionalism, to the African identity? Because she marries and then she comes to Uganda, and you can see the spaces where there's marriage taking place, where her where her daughter is marrying, and she is all involved in this, and she's talking about the emancipation of the African woman. Beyond the emancipation of the African woman, your analysis of the significance of marriage for African women, for issues of nationalism, regionalism, And also the analysis of motherism. Is there anything that you see coming in through the thread of understanding her life as a mother and as a national figure? Then secondly, she did education, she studied education, and I'm happy that I listened to you saying that she talks about the importance of educating the girl child, free education for children as far back as that time, which is very important. What are some of the themes that are coming out in reading her life, other than working in the women's movement and being a part of the historical I'm forgetting the name of the organization right now, the historical Uganda Council for Women, which you talk about coming up in 1959. I think I'll talk about that, but otherwise I'm very, very excited that you're doing this project, and I think we should be reading each other more. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions. And there's a question online from Jonathan Wesigwa that asks, what would Pumla Kisosokole probably say to the current Mengo establishment, counting at least from 1993, after the restoration of the Kabakaship, about the issue of Buganda's sovereignty as compared to the 1950s? You know, it's the 1990s and the 1960s were both periods where Buganda's sovereignty was the center of public life. I might add, yeah, Christopher, or should I let you have the question at the end? Let me just add one quick question about, and then I'll hand it over, about the other thing that seems to be significant is that the central ideology, we were reading with our master's class who are here today, Ali Marie Tripp's article just on Monday. And one of the key ideologies, she argues, of the Uganda Council of Women was non-racialism. And I'm wondering if you're able to trace anything about what non-racialism meant across these contexts from South Africa to Uganda. I think Tripp argues that it means something very specific in the Ugandan context that's different from multiracialism, which was opposed by all of the political parties because it was seen as a way to entrench Asian and European power. So yeah, that seemed, and also just to echo really the beautiful last paragraph that you read, and why I think it's very significant for methodologically to think about when something gets written, especially a biographical piece, it often is sort of set in stone, like this is the authoritative version of this person, and it erases all of the work that we do as researchers, the connections that we have, the positionalities that we mobilize consciously, unconsciously. And I think there's something really important there that you've had to say about making that visible for us. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Edgar, and thank you, Dr. Athambile, for that very interesting introduction to your project, and indeed a very great project that you have ahead of you. So I'm interested in who this figure understood as herself. First, if we take her name as an entry point, you have her as Pumla Ngozwana, right? And here in Uganda, even when we were listening to Dr. Professor Shiguli, she kept saying Pumla Chisosonkole. So even me as a Ugandan, and I think when I tweeted, I said, I wrote Pumla Ngozwana Chisosonkole. I had to add Chisosonkole because that makes meaning to us as Ugandans. And I think back in South Africa, then you don't need to add Chisosonkole. So how did she understand herself? In identifying herself, I'm wondering whether you have access to evidence that helps you to understand this is how she styled herself. Before we style her, this is how she identified herself. This is who she said she was. Did she identify herself as a wife of someone, as Mrs. So-and-so? Because some people like to say, I'm Mrs. So-and-so, I'm Professor So-and-so. Others, they don't do those titles. Others would say, I'm South African Ugandan. Others, because they are married to a Ugandan, would say, I'm actually a Ugandan. Others would say, I'm a Ugandan I'm South African in Uganda. So, and I mean, she had those different hats, so to say. But I'm curious to if you will be able to tell us that story of how she identified herself. Talking about stories, and I like the way you are telling the story. But also curious, you are telling this story, can I say positionality, as an African woman, as an academician, as a scholar? How are you telling this story? And so in your talk, you gave, was that, forgive me if I mispronounce or fail to actually pronounce the word, Tosa? Yes, that there was a proverb in there. And as a band speaker, I actually could tell what it meant in English because I could figure it out. So when you used that in your talk, I was actually excited. I was like, okay, even in her book, it will be peppered with lots of that. And so then I was like, okay, if you tell a story from that from that angle, probably the way you tell the story is influenced by your culture, will probably be different as an African woman, as a woman from that culture. There are certain things you'll be focusing on, giving prominence. I don't know, I'm just asking. And methodologically, and using serendipity, that was very interesting, which probably the government wouldn't be happy to hear, in the sense that, I mean, the government wants to structure everything. You don't do research outside government structures. But here you are actually getting a lot. You are accessing a lot without government having to stamp to agree that you go and meet so-and-so. So you are doing a lot, you're achieving a lot. And like Professor Chiguri said, there is a lot that people can learn in terms of methods, the way we do things. So there is a lot there. And lastly, and I'm sorry I took long, Edgar, lastly, I'm wondering, and you don't have to answer this really, but I'm wondering, how would this story be different? Maybe this is something that could be asked at the end of the project. But how would this story be different if it is told by a man, for instance? If it is told by a Ugandan who has to travel to South Africa? If it is told by a non-African, so to say, like, what do we miss? What do we gain? I know, like you said, when you are a visitor, when you come to Uganda, you will get access to certain people, certain information easily, because you are who you are, a visitor. And it may take ages for some people to access those same people that you have accessed. So again, you don't have to answer this, but it's a comment. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I just want to check, David, did you have another question, or is that the same hand? Yeah. I think that's the same hand that was up before. So, yeah. So, yes, please. I think you'll have to come up and sorry.
Okay, thanks so much for this opportunity. My concern is, like on Monday when we are studying the article of Married Trip, we saw that these women organizations or women movements did not involved in politics. So my concern is, did she involve in politics? And another thing is, we saw Barbara Sabin being elected in the Uganda parliament. Now did she get involved in politics? Another thing is, we saw like women movements, mostly the Uganda Council of Women, it had two objectives. One was to unite women of all races, Asians, Europeans, and Africans, and to fight for their rights and children's rights. So my concern is, we saw in Kenya, they had a challenge whereby Europeans did not cooperate or did not work with the Africans. And here is this woman, an activist for women. I think, in my understanding, her work was to unite all women in Africa. So her work remained here in Uganda, or she also went to Kenya and failed to unite those women? Thank you.
So you have another question. How many questions can you, let's take one. Yeah, that's good. Great. All right. We just need a microphone.
Just wondering, for those of us who are into life writing, literature and stuff like that, we know that when you journey with someone, somehow something happens to you. And I know this for sure, that the journeys that we take, even when we read texts, are journeys that affect how we see life, how we see different spaces and contexts within which we think. And this happens a lot in literary studies. You read a text, you find yourself in Nigeria, in South Africa. And Susan and I have talked about an incident where we started wondering about if someone understood apartheid and what it did to South Africa and how he was relating it to something here. But I'm thinking about this and asking, this journey with Pumla, right from Southern Africa to Uganda, how has it caused an evolution in you and your thinking about Pumla, but also about collaborations right from the south to the east? I mean, both parts of the Indian Ocean, of course, we are a landlocked country, so we are now an East African community from the Indian to the Atlantic. That's another story for another day. I see this, of course, because somehow, like I said, we journey with our research projects, and sometimes we shift our personal imaginations of history and experience. So I'm thinking how this journey with Pumla has helped you also sometimes probably evolve your own thinking. But also, and this goes back to the issue of transnational spaces, how do you see this narrative as reinforcing collaborations that sometimes we put at the periphery, where we really should have thought about these things a little more? Why? Because here is a lady who comes from Southern Africa, comes here and settles here, and actually adopts the cultures of the people here. And, you know, like the video he talks about, I mean, that's what mothers-in-law do. And so you start wondering, okay, how does she now identify or even define herself? But also, are these transnational collaborations and the ability to travel within and between these spaces able to probably help in the way we define ourselves and construct our personal, national, and sometimes transnational identities? I mean, these are all things to think through in many ways. I love the question that Ebila asked on marriage, because marrying into a family does many things to you as a person, especially for the woman. And for her, I don't know whether she drops everything South African, but you see, when you think about what marriage does to her and she takes on a new identity. You remember our first conversation probably sometime last year, where as soon as you said Chisoso Nkola, I said, royal family, you are in trouble. You see that? How you deal with these things, of course, and different spaces then that you occupy is probably something I would like you to think about, especially in light of transnational collaborations. Thank you.
And there's one more question online as well. So But it actually goes very well with the what was just asked. So for those who are in the room and can't see it, Lillian and Babazi asked if I could. Sorry, if I could just for time just to read it out loud. Asks, do you think that the notion of place or her coming to Uganda and the status that she came with her marriage in this quote unquote new space underscored her contribution toward who she became? And so there are quite a lot of questions on the table, really thought-provoking ones. Can speak to as many as you want, feel able to in one sitting, but yeah.
Wow, thank you everyone. Such generous and generative questions. I'll keep to some of the order of the ones that I think I will focus on. To speak to what Dr. Athambile asked, the history before coming to Uganda, you're absolutely right. There is some work that I need to still do there, but I mean, I know the area that she comes from. She comes from Mount Freya. I know her father was in the Methodist Church. I know the schools that she went to. Incidentally, the school that she went to was the same school my grandmother went to, which kind of helped me understand her world. And I think one of the things that I found frustrating with that initial article that I was speaking about that features her in the newspaper is that her mother is absent. And one of my mentors back home has always asked this question of how much can we understand about people who don't know who their mothers are? And in another figure who I've done research on, Noni Jabavu, as soon as I understood her mother, I began to understand the writer Noni Jabavu so much better. So you're absolutely right. And I do want to include some of that in that very first chapter, not to undermine that foundation, because to some of the questions that have come up, I think that the foundations of who she becomes in South Africa are incredibly important, because she comes, I mean, if she was born in 1911, if I'm correct, and she comes here in the 1939, she's already a grown woman. She's already worked. She's a professional. So there's a lot of identity formation in that process. In terms of the daughter in the UK, I've been having conversations with people back and forth. I haven't been to the UK yet, but recently with the person who connected me to her was in South Africa recently, and I had the opportunity to send her a gift, something that I've written about her mother. So I'm also, I think, trying to build rapport and get a better understanding about who she is and to what extent she is willing to share. She has already shared a family tree, which is really cool. So she knows that the research is happening. And I think that's like the other side of this that I haven't actually put in this chapter. Some of this work, just engaging with family, is like a whole other thing methodologically, right? Especially in an African context. And I didn't anticipate that until I started doing this research. So here I'm just writing about my friends, but just the ability of a family member saying yes or no about certain information is a really, and just out of respect and out of honor, would I then still go ahead and publish a certain thing? So I think that's some of the ethics about historical research methodology in the context where I'm not going to a box and the box is there, and like the idea of boxes and papers is kind of neutral, because a box can't speak back to you, but a family member can, and that's something I'm still trying to work through. The significance of marriage was huge during this area. Actually, the students will probably be able to answer better, because that trip reading speaks a lot about the politics of marriage and the powers that people understood what marriage meant. Because I didn't realize until that trip reading that for Indian women who arrived here, they didn't have any rights. They didn't have any marriage rights. And in fact, all of this work happening in the 40s, 50s, 60s sets up what the work that Mrs. Kalema does when she's in Parliament. I mean, there's a whole document that I think she prepares. It begins with the work of Barbara Sabin, but by the end, Mrs. Kalema, there's a report, and it's somewhere in my folders, about the position of marriage and what women want to advocate for marriages. So their position as married women was very much a political thing. And to your question about politics, I think, and motherism and wifehood and the public life is that, and I've seen this in South Africa as well, is that women women build politics around their private lives. So the fact that in our context in South Africa, a lot of when we talk about the pass laws, the apartheid law that said women must carry passes, women were saying this is demeaning to us as women, this is demeaning to us as mothers, this is demeaning to us as wives. So that is politics. The idea of being a wife, the idea of being a mother is sometimes and it's a legitimate starting point. It's not, can we go to war? It's not, can I get education for my children? Can I get access to healthcare? And I think that's why this conversation of do women do leadership differently is always at the heart of it, because it comes from a different vantage point. Not to say that women won't say, I want certain rights because I want to go to war. I think that's a separate conversation, but it is that sense for me is that I want to be a better mother. And if you're putting restrictions on me, or if you're not giving me the right to open a bank account, once upon a time, women couldn't do that. The right to own property, the right to inherit. Huge politics around this time about marriage is inheritance. And can women inherit widows? Can widows inherit their husband's property, or does it go to a relative? That's a political issue because it's about, can I provide for my children? So I think those two themes, questions kind of come together. And this question of motherism, and I think her being the mother-in-law of the Kabaka, and then the position that women take, that protest when the Kabaka is exiled, is very much about mothers. And I think that question of motherism, Western feminism wants to undermine, as though being a mother isn't a solid political position. And I think African women have always understood that that position of being a mother and a wife has political legitimacy with all its problems. But yeah. Oh, this question about the Buganda sovereignty, now I don't think I can answer. I'm not going to answer that because I think it requires me to have an understanding of what is happening at the moment. And I think once I've read more about the historical context and what is happening in the moment right now, I would be able to get a sense of that. And then this question of non-racialism is so interesting, and what the UCW, excuse me, was trying to do, and was so innovative in its approach, which then gets cut short when the National Council of Women comes into play, is that my understanding of how Pumla herself, or Mrs. Chisosonkole herself, positions is that my reading and my understanding of the period in South Africa that she kind of emerges from was very much invested in non-racialism. So it wasn't new to her to have this. So the kind of people who were in her world, her social world, the Frida Matthews, for example, had a good friend who's a famous, prominent anthropologist in South Africa, Monica Wilson. They had gone to school together. So even though our understanding of South Africa segregation and apartheid really like makes those racial rulings separate. There was a time, and a lot of people now are going back to that period of this interwar period of segregation, and even earlier than that, where the missionary schools that people like Ngozwana would have gone to would have had white teachers, would have had white peers, would have had, so one of her nieces, in a sense, Noni Jabavu, writes about Alice, because it's a university town where she goes to University Fort Hare, it's a multicultural town. So that question of her coming out of that and bringing some of those ideas into, and participating in those ideas that other women have already established, because the council is established in 1942, it's not unfamiliar to her. Perhaps it's even, and it's something that filters throughout in kind of the Southern African nationalist politics about, it's something that we're still talking about today in South Africa, about non-racialism, about identity. So it's a really interesting thing. I mean, there's a beautiful extract, you'll know, in the one chapter, Tripp's chapter, where one of the Indian women is so taken aback by the friendship and the warmth. I think there was a genuine warmth amongst the women about being in collaboration, being in solidarity together. But I think a lot of it has to do, and I think a lot of it has to do with coming from a church background. I mean, she comes from a Methodist church. Methodist church in Southern Africa is a really interesting story in terms of racialism as well. It had its own politics. So there's a Methodist church, and then there were others who then established independent churches. But within the Methodist church, there's a history of really debating about the the privileges or the position of Black clergy, which her father would have been. So I hope to find more evidence about maybe her father's own participation in thinking about that in the context of the church, but definitely the missionary schools were thinking about those ideas. I love all the questions that you gave me. I mean, I'm just sitting here and being like, oh my gosh, yes, yes, yes. How does she understand herself? That is probably one of the biggest challenges about some of the women that I write about who have these overt public lives. So when I first encounter her, I'm encountering her in a public sense. She's on a stage, she's giving a speech. Where are those personable moments? And I think some of them, I hope, will emerge in if there's a way of getting access to letters. Because I think letters and building those collaborations that Isaac talks about is then getting a sense of what is her personal investment, or what is her personhood. And I think the other problem is we always, I mean, when these larger than life characters emerge, they're also so perfect. Like, why does she have to be so perfect? Why does she always have to be on the right side of the debate? Maybe we'll find that she was quite bossy. Maybe we'll find that there are people that she backstabbed. And that's okay because she's human, right? But if we only ever find her in relation to the things that she's written about, then that is a problem. And I'm going to sit with that question and start finding those moments of who does she say she is? And I'm really going to press and try get more access to letters of friendships. I mean, there's this warmth in the movements, but who is her best friend that she writes to when the Kabaka goes into exile? You know, or when there's a fascinating story I just learned about. So because of the Sarah Damali interaction, there was then a problem with which child gets baptized, Sarah's child or Damali's child, and there was a whole friction there, and the church didn't want to baptize the child that wasn't born in marriage. And then her and the husband get disciplined by the church because they attend the baptism or the non-baptism of the child that is going to be heir and needs to be baptized. I mean, already that's like a grainy family drama that is in a church archive somewhere, but how would I be able to read her own position saying, actually, I don't care what the church says, I need to protect what this family needs. And that's maybe her positioning as a mother. But yeah, I have a tension with this private and public archive and how to really get to the granular sense of that. Yeah, maybe one or two more comments because yeah, 4 questions was amazing. How am I telling the story? You know, I think in my mind, when I tell some of these stories, I think of myself as like this grandchild who has these grandmothers who have these lives that they want people to know about for whatever reason. And so that's why I talk about being like a story catcher. It's like I find a sense of responsibility to tell these stories. And so that's why I will go to another country unprovoked. No one invited me here. I was just like, I'm going to Uganda for a week, you know, I'm following the story, but there's a sense of responsibility. And maybe it is that responsibility and like an African sensibility about elders have a responsibility to the young also have a responsibility to the elders. And I think my role as a young person, I'm incredibly privileged. I've had a great education. I've had all these wonderful things, and I have way more than someone 2-3 generations before me had. And so it is my responsibility to tell the story. That's all I'm asked to do. I can totally do it, and it's easy for me. So I think that's part of the positioning, but also part of the fact that there's the identity of being a Xhosa woman and like having a sense of the sensibilities around some of that. And I hope to bring in more of that sensibility. I mean, I'm really, one thing that's actually lacking is I don't know her clan name. And I know clan names are very important here, and they're important to us too. I still don't know her clan name. And I think this research will be incomplete if I can't refer to her by her clan name. So I think those are some of the sensibilities of being able to identify some of those gaps in how I'm telling the story. Yeah, I think I'll pause there for now, but thank you so much. These were you're leaving me with like 3 pages of questions, or 4 pages of questions that are going to inform going back to this chapter and other chapters as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I think just thank you very much, and thank you to the audience as well for this really amazing discussion. I apologize that we've gone well over our advertised time, but I think it's been worth it to have this discussion. So just like to thank you again. Thank everyone online. Just know this is our last seminar for the semester, but we do have seminars fairly regularly. They'll be starting again in January. So if you'd like to know more, just let me know. So thank you again for being here.